How many of you have already frozen or are thinking of freezing your eggs or your sperm? We had a talk earlier this morning about the future of human reproduction. And it's scary when we think about the way that we've done sex for the past billion or so years and where we're going. There's a lot of change. But the real underlying revolutionary aspect of the change in reproduction isn't just how we make babies, it's the nature of the babies that we make. So think about that. When Watson and Crick identified the double helix structure of DNA in the 1950s, what they were doing was identifying that there is a manual of life, a manual containing the code of life. And when we learned how to sequence the genome, and when the Human Genome Project culminated in 2003, we proved that the code of life was made up of letters that could be read. And now, at the dawn of the age of human genetic engineering, and I think many of you have heard of CRISPR and other gene editing tools, we are beginning to be able to write the code of life. So when we think about a technology that's readable, that's writable, and that's hackable, all of us naturally think about information technology. But what's really happening now, why this is such a revolutionary moment, is that our biology is coming to be seen as yet another form of information technology. And that's why we have all of these expectations that our machines will get better, our iPhones will get smaller and faster. But when we think about humans 200 years from now, 300 years from now in our sci-fi movies and elsewhere, humans are kind of like us. But after 3.8 billion years of evolving by one set of rules, which we call the Darwinian principles of random mutation and natural selection, our species is now turning an evolutionary corner. And from this point on, we are going to evolve and begin evolving by an entirely new set of rules of self-guided mutation and self-selected mutation, and self-selection. And the implications of this are beyond monumental. One easy way of thinking about this is if we had a time machine and we traveled 1,000 years into the past and we took a baby and brought that baby back to today and placed that baby with a family, that child would grow up to be indistinguishable from any person in this room. But go 1,000 years into the future and bring a child back, and that child would be a genetic Superman or Superwoman. They would be immune to all kinds of diseases that afflict us. They would live longer, healthier, more robust lives. They would have qualities that we now associate with human outliers, like our greatest geniuses or people with all kinds of skills, whether it's music, art, or all sorts of things. And I know what you're thinking, and we'll talk about the ethics. And this person would just be incredible by today's standards, but normal by the standards of the future. And it's easy to come in a stage like this with techno-futurists like all of you and say, we're going to this crazy place, and I myself am a science fiction writer. And if we didn't already have the technology to do all of the things that I've mentioned so far, this would just be a futurist sci-fi talk. But in fact, all of the technologies that we need to fundamentally transform our species aren't yet to be invented. They have already been invented. And all we need to do is continue developing those technologies, not even at the rate as fast as we've already done, but even at a slower rate. And in the not distant future, we will be rewriting the code of our lives. And on top of that, we know that technology doesn't slow. As a matter of fact, it speeds up. And that every time we have a new technology like CRISPR gene editing, it seems really cool at the time, just like we all thought the Sony Walkman was really cool at the time. But technology has a way of moving on an exponential curve. And so what are these three phases of change that are already taking place? The first is something we're all familiar with, IVF, in vitro fertilization. Everybody knows about IVF. It's been around for almost exactly 40 years. As a matter of fact, on July 25th is the 40th birthday of Louise Brown, who was the first IVF, what they then called test tube baby. And so with IVF, though, there's a second process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, or PGS, genetic screening. And what that is during IVF, you extract eggs from the woman, and on average, woman has about 15 eggs extracted during IVF. And then you fertilize those eggs with the male sperm, and there's hundreds of millions of male sperm in the average ejaculation, so sperm is easy to come by, as Martine mentioned this morning. And then you grow these eggs for about 5 days, 5 to 7 days, and you extract 5 or so cells from each of those. You sequence those cells, and then you get a lot of information about each of those 15 or 10 or whatever the number is pre-implanted embryos. And so what can you tell about those pre-implanted embryos? Well, you can tell anything that you can tell from genome sequencing. And what can you learn from genome sequencing? Well, right now, it's single gene mutation diseases are the primary focus, and a few relatively genetically simple traits like hair color and eye color. But we are moving towards a stage where we are going to know more and more about what our genes do. And the reason for that is that having nothing to do with the future of reproduction, we're moving towards a world of precision medicine. And that means rather than having medicine based on generalities and averages, your healthcare will be based on you personally. And so your sequenced genome will be the foundation of your electronic medical record. And because of that, we will ultimately have billions of people whose genomes will be sequenced and electronically available, and their life records will also be digitized and available. And by comparing the two, we're going to be able to learn a lot more, not just about single gene mutation diseases, but about extremely complex, mostly or even partly genetic traits like height, like intelligence, like personality style. And then, using this exact same process, but adding another technology that already exists, called the process for creating induced pluripotent stem cells. And Shinya Yamanaka won a Nobel Prize for this discovery in 2012. We're going to be able to turn any adult cell, a specialized cell, into a stem cell, and then into another type of cell. So the way this would work is you take a blood sample or a skin graft, you turn those skin cells into stem cells into egg precursor cells, and those egg precursor cells into eggs. Now, rather than having 10 or 15 eggs, you have 100 or you have 1,000. You fertilize all of those eggs, and now the range of what you're choosing, let's say it's 1,000. And so for whatever you are selecting for, the range, whether it's IQ or height, you'll have a much greater range if you're choosing from 1,000 and then if you're choosing from 10. And then what you can do is have these early stage pre-implanted embryos, and again, I'm aware of all the ethical issues, and I'm aware that we're in Germany talking about these issues, so we'll talk about this in a moment. But then what you can, or I should say could do, is take these early stage pre-implanted embryos, maybe the one you chose of 1,000, and you could do that same process with their cells, so generate eggs from a pre-implanted embryo, or sperm from another pre-implanted embryo, and those 5 to 7 day old embryos could then have a child. And so what that means is right now it takes a little under 30 years to pass a human generation, but we could be passing human generations in 6 months. And so that means 60 generations in the space of 1. And what does that mean? Our ancestors, only using selective breeding, took the wild chicken that lays 1 egg a month and turned it into the domestic chicken that lays 1 egg a day. So we can go a long way with this type of embryo selection. And then we haven't even spoken yet about gene editing and CRISPR. And gene editing has been around for a while, but what CRISPR does is make editing any genome, including our genome, by far faster, cheaper, and easier than ever before. People use the analogy of editing a Microsoft Word document. It's probably harder than that, but the rate of improvement is so quick that we are moving in that direction. And it won't be that we're going to be creating whole humans from scratch, but already barriers are falling on gene editing pre-implanted embryos in the animal kingdom, and very soon it will start with humans to eliminate deadly single gene mutation diseases, and sickle cell disease will probably be the first. So this is where we are going. And there are a lot of propellants why we are going to move forward more quickly, I think, than most people are ready for. The first is that we are culturally diverse. We are diverse within communities, between societies. For many of us who come from Judeo-Christian traditions, even the atheists among us have this sense that there is some kind of order in the universe. Some call it God, some call it nature, but there's this sense that there's this order, and that if you mess with that order, you do it at your own risk. But not every society thinks that. And our societies, we didn't always think it. We happen to think it now. In other countries, China is a good example, don't have the same kind of reservations about these kinds of genetic transformations as we have. So this kind of diversity is propellant number one. Propellant number two is competition. We are a hubristic, aggressive species. It's our entire history. Our entire history, there's many of us, myself included, who love nature, but our entire history as a species has been our war with nature. If we had just accepted our fate as nature, whatever that means, had set up for us, we would still be living in caves. We wouldn't have agriculture. We wouldn't have healthcare. We probably also wouldn't have nuclear weapons and all these other terrible things. But the history of our species is not one of coexistence with nature. Even the groups that we idealize as coexisting with nature, they aren't coexisting with nature. So we are a hubristic species, and we are very, very different. And it's part of our nature that humans are always seeking advantages. And that's why, on an individual level, so many parents go to such great lengths to give their kids advantages. You only have to go to South Korea and look at their cram schools, where 75% of the kids in the country are going to these cram schools to prepare for the national college entrance exam. The government had to put a ban on these little kids being in these schools past 10 p.m. because these kids were pulling multiple all-nighters. What will parents do to protect their children, not just to get them into good schools, but to enhance their possibility of living healthy lives, of having super capabilities, of having a higher IQ or more emotional intelligence or whatever people want? And people will compete with each other. And communities will compete with each other, and countries will compete with each other. Whatever we may think, our countries, in particular, I come from the United States, and I love, the United States has a great history, but this is really a desperate moment, and please stick with us. I hope we will fix this, but that's a talk for another day. But we are where science and technology is something that's good and great for everybody, but there is a battle going on for technological primacy. The United States certainly has led the way since the end of the Second World War, maybe even a little bit before. But right now, anyone who's read China's National Artificial Intelligence Plan, this is not a plan for a country that's saying, hey, this is a win-win for everybody. This is a country which has a very specific and clearly articulated goal. And all of the technologies of the future, but certainly genetics among them, are going to be part of this competition. So there are a lot of really important competitive pressures that are pushing everybody forward and all the countries forward. But at the same time, there are monumental ethical issues. As I said before, we are in Germany, and there's no place where this idea of selecting and making determinations of which children should come into this world and should not is more sensitive than here, and I'm certainly aware of that. But at the same time, we are moving in this direction. We really are going to need to think about how do we deal with issues of diversity. And there could be, diversity, sometimes we think about it and say, well, I'm going to have a company with different kinds of people. I'm going to have a conference or a university. But diversity is much more than that. Diversity is the sole survival strategy of our species. If we didn't have diversity, we would still be single-cell organisms, because diversity is another name for mutation. It's the differences between us. And so if we start making genetic decisions based on things that we think are really good, like a higher IQ, like greater empathy, like avoiding disease, really anything, there's a danger that we could limit the genetic diversity of our species. At the same time, actually opposing this idea is issues of equality. And so we all recognize that equality of access to this kind of technology is absolutely critical. But it's also true that if we have too much genetic equality, that gets back to the diversity point. If we have too much genetic equality, we also are at risk. So how do we balance our need for diversity, our desire for equality, but also the danger of having too much equality, genetic equality? And then thirdly, we have this incredible new technology, but how do we think about integrating this exponentially growing revolutionary technology with these hard-won value systems that we have taken thousands of years to generate? And so one way that we're going to have to struggle with this is through figuring out regulation, both nationally and internationally. And the challenge that we face, though, is while the science is developing exponentially and our understanding of it is advancing linearly, the regulatory environment is only advancing glacially. And the key for what we need to do to develop the kinds of norms we're going to need to help guide ourselves through this incredible opportunity and this challenge is to bring everybody in the world into this conversation. What we need is a species-wide dialogue on the future of human genetic engineering. Because for past technologies, we didn't have the ability to bring everybody in. At the dawn of the industrial age, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have levels of literacy like we now have. But everybody needs to be part of that process. And I will cede the last 2 seconds of my talk to Bianca.
Yes. Jamie, what a juicy topic. Have a seat. I have so many questions for you, so you can still ask them.
Yes.
So the obvious questions were first, how do we address the inevitable inability of the poor, the bulk of the human population, to benefit from those technologies?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And what I always say is we must find a way to make this technology accessible to everybody. But as we imagine our future inequality in the context of the genetics revolution, what we should do is say, well, how can we start today living the values of equality? So the difference between everybody in this room and the average person in the Central African Republic is huge. It's not just that you're all on average, going to live longer. It's not just that you're healthier. It's that your kids will have a higher IQ than most of the kids born in the Central African Republic. Not because they're naturally smarter, but because if you don't have proper nutrition, it harms your brain function. And so it's a real issue. The answer is values. If we have those values for the future, let's start deploying them now.
Okay. We've talked about kids and eggs a lot today, and we want to talk about more eggs. So the question is, can we breed a super chicken that lays 1,000 eggs a day?
You know, maybe we can. And, you know, I will take a look. Yes, we can. And the reason is because we need to continue to hack the chicken. We have hacked the chicken over about 6,000 or 7,000 years. There's no reason to believe that an egg must be made inside of a chicken. So this one chicken could have 10,000 eggs as long as we take the egg creation out of the inside of the chicken. That's what Martine was talking about. We're just moving around and repositioning the pieces of biology.
Hacking the chicken, I love that term. More juicy questions. Oh my God, they're voting crazy. Okay, top 10 is shifting our evolution from natural selection to human selection gives that power in hands of the few, countries, races, of the rich. How do we deal with this?
Yeah, and again, everything is about values. Everything is about norms. If we want to have, right now, from where we are beginning, there's a utopian future, there's a dystopian future, and there's something in the middle. The only thing that will determine where we go are the norms, the values that we deploy, and the norms that we develop. And the more people who we can bring into this process, the better chance we will have of avoiding that very real possibility.
Fantastic. There's so many interesting questions there. The good news is, Jamie hasn't asked me anything tomorrow afternoon. Please storm this tent, ask this man anything, so that we know how to evolve this human race. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.